Excellent. Welcome everybody to the introduction webinar to budget advocacy to address child marriage. My name is Matilda Branson, so I'm working at the Girls Not Brides Secretariat in London with the policy and advocacy team. I'm also, you'll see me joined as Zoe Birchall, my colleague who does global advocacy. If that seems a little confusing, I'm using her Zoom account. I hope that everyone can hear me okay. This webinar will last for 1 hour. We also have from the Secretariat my colleague Alexandra Newlands in our partnership team who will be moderating, keeping an eye on the chat. So if we're not responding during the presentation, Alexandra is moderating the discussion and she'll be collating different questions as we go along, and then we'll be having a Q&A towards the end of the webinar where we'll try and address some of your key questions raised. This webinar is designed to very much be an introduction to the topic of budget advocacy and how it relates to child marriage. And it's part of efforts by the Girls Not Brides Secretariat to build up a critical mass of civil society members and other stakeholders who are interested and dedicated to using budget advocacy as a key strategy in broader advocacy efforts to end child marriage. So the webinar format today is quite simple. We're going to run through very quickly the basics around budget advocacy. We'll then talk a bit about how budget advocacy relates to addressing child marriage. We'll look a little bit at the role of civil society in budget advocacy in ending child marriage. And then I'll talk a little bit about the key resources that are available that can support you in your work going forward. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So as we're going along in the presentation, please write your questions in the comments box to everyone. That's located, if you're on your computer, it will be located to the right-hand side. If you're accessing Zoom on your mobile phone, it will be located in the comments at the bottom of your screen as well. So please put your questions in there, and my colleague Alexandra will be collating them, and we'll try to address as many as we can towards the end of the webinar. So about budget advocacy, we're going to jump straight into the topic. So first of all, why are government budgets important for girls? So Girls Not Brides, we speak a lot about governments having to walk the talk and to demonstrate political will to end child marriage. So if we consider government funding allocations being a mirror of political will, then it's through the budgetary allocation that a government shows it's committed to meet the needs of its people, and especially the most vulnerable, such as adolescent girls. And that the decisions that governments make about funding policies, programs, and services for girls have a direct impact on a girl's life, perhaps through her health, her education, her safety, protection from violence, and many other areas. So for example, schools, very important, but a school with poor quality education that might be a result of high teacher absenteeism, which itself might be due to delayed salary payments, is as a result of poor funding flows. Or if we look at the hospital in the left-hand corner, a lack of health supplies due to poor costing or an inequitable distribution of funds to a hospital and to health services might result in devastating health outcomes for a teenage mother and her newborn child when they go to the local health post. Similarly, girls, especially married girls who are victims of domestic violence, might be unable to access safe houses or gender-based violence support services because the funding to run them, as many of you would know, simply doesn't exist, or local law enforcement or maybe social welfare services lack the capacity, time, knowledge, to run these kind of services. So this is why we want to see that these interventions for girls are planned for, costed, and funded across sectors in government budgets. And we want to see, more importantly, that those funds are spent effectively at all levels for girls. So moving into what do we mean when we're talking about budget advocacy? So budget advocacy, in the way that we're working on it, is really a strategic approach to influence government's budget choices with the clear goal to achieve very clear and specific outcomes. And we really seek, through budget advocacy, to intervene in the decision-making processes of government in 4 different ways. So the first way that we might approach budget advocacy is through policy change. So perhaps through promoting policy reform with government. So we might engage with policy makers and decision makers to change policies and legislation. We might be analysing the issues. We might advocate the champion of the creation of new laws or new public programs and activities, or modifications of existing laws and programs as it relates to the budget process and cycle. The second way we might want to intervene through budget advocacy is looking at policy implementation. So we might be asking government to implement a policy for adolescent girls or ending child marriage, to adopt it from the national level and to ensure it's implemented to the local level. Policy implementation might involve monitoring that implementation as well and the effectiveness of it. The third way that budget advocacy seeks to intervene is through changing the decision-making system. So this is when advocates actually turn their attention to the decision-making system itself, perhaps by demanding transparency and access to information, or to secure opportunities for public involvement, or to demand for clearer oversight of how public funds and public programs are managed by government. And the last way that budget advocacy might be conducted is through the mobilisation and empowerment of citizens to be able to engage their governments and to be equipped and motivated to do advocacy around budget processes. So that's the last one, is really around empowering the people whose lives are impacted by public decisions to understand the issues involved and then to be able to take action on their own behalf. And just a quick note on budget analysis and budget advocacy and how they fit together. So budget advocacy really combines 2 key elements that are important to mention. So the first aspect is really around budget analysis. So it's that capacity to have access to budget information, to analyse it, which can often be a little bit technical and involve a lot of analysis around existing budgets, future budgets, forecasts, etc. And then to be able to explain the implications of what you're seeing in the numbers in really clear and compelling ways. And then the second element of budget advocacy is really linked to your broader advocacy efforts. So it's really that capacity to take the information from your budget analysis to then conduct your more broader and strategic advocacy. So that's then that ability to use the really detailed, concise numbers from your budget analysis to then link it to your campaign, to mobilise the public, to reach out to other decision makers, policy makers, perhaps to the media with what you found out through your budget analysis. And it's by combining these 2 elements that civil society is able to really make a difference in influencing those public budgets. And you can see on the right the budget cycle, which you might be familiar with. It varies a little bit between countries, but it's the overall general cycle that we see on budgetary process in different countries. So turning now to how budget advocacy relates to child marriage. So firstly, why is budget advocacy needed to end child marriage? So this work has really come for Girls Not Brides, that over the last 7 or 8 years, we've seen the emerging of over 30 countries that have developed national strategies to address child marriage. And these strategies are very holistic, multi-sectoral, involving all of the different sectors in government, so health, education, child protection, justice, social protection, etc. And we've seen these formations, sometimes they're called national strategies or national action plans, national strategic frameworks. They have many different names, and we've seen a number of campaigns and programs as well, headed up by governments to address child marriage at scale. But now we're in a position where it's really important to see those policies to address child marriage, to see that they're implemented. And what we're learning is that often the domestic resource allocation is not there to ensure their implementation. So firstly, budget advocacy is really important to help move those national policies that already exist to tackle child marriage. And that also includes policies perhaps around girls' education or SRHR within different other sectors as well. And so that links very much to the second reason, that we need to see that governments are going to take action and to involve all the relevant ministries to also show that leadership to take action on child marriage. And we're really asking governments to integrate a focus on child marriage into the work plans and the specific budgets of relevant ministries and departments, and to also ensure that cross-government coordination. And in this, subnational and local governments have a critical role to play in reaching the most at-risk girls and also married girls. The third reason we need budget advocacy is very much around the imperative that adolescent girls' voices and issues can't be forgotten or ignored in national and subnational budgetary processes. So, I mean, while a government's budget directly or indirectly affects the life of all of its citizens, it's often the poorest who are influenced the most by budget decisions or macroeconomic factors like low economic growth or inflation. So girls who are at risk of child marriage and married girls tend to live in poverty, and child marriage perpetuates that vicious cycle of poverty. So these girls are often found to be among the most vulnerable and marginalised population, and they're often invisible to decision makers. So they're potentially the most impacted by budget decisions that affect or fail to affect them. The fourth reason is that we need to see budget information and decision-making process demystified. So in most countries, there's often an absence of information on budget issues and processes, or if it exists, it's often really inaccessible and in very technical forms. So it's often very difficult for civil society and citizens to actively participate in discussions on the distribution of public funds. So learning about budget information and the budget process in your country can be really powerful, because as civil society advocates, if you know a lot about the policy issues, so if we know a lot about child marriage, which all of you on the line do know, if you know a lot about that and combine it with a really solid knowledge of the budget process in your country, that can potentially be a really great way of influencing policy and budgetary decisions. So when civil society, what we see within Girls Not Brides membership is that when a civil society organisation learns about the budget process and how to influence it, they can break that monopoly held by government, which is usually that very small group of people in the bureaucracy who prepare the budget. The fifth reason is that what we see is that often if funds do exist for girls, they often don't reach where they're meant to go. So often that might be due to weak expenditure and program management. It just might mean that the money never reached the intended girls. And the last reason is very much linking to the fulfillment of human rights and the rights of girls and women, that a lack of budget can actually impact directly on the achievement of their rights. So budget analysis intends to operationalize those rights, in a sense, by turning that policy rhetoric into certain rights through that budget allocation, through government showing that it is going to support the rights of girls through budget allocation in various sectors. Challenges to budget advocacy. We have found, so Girls Not Brides Secretariat has been doing a lot of scoping, research, consultations with both members and experts alike on this topic, because it is quite complex because of the number of sectors involved. And there are a number of challenges that exist that we are learning to work around, but that are important to flag up, and that I'm sure many of you find in your own work. So the first challenge is very much the governments don't budget for human rights. And that sounds very obvious, But I think as civil society advocates, often we come to this issue from a human rights or child rights, girls' rights angle. And what we're finding as we're conducting this budget advocacy is that, you know, governments, when we're talking to the Ministry of Finance or certain line ministries and asking for budget, you know, to address child marriage, they say, okay, well, we're happy to do that, but what actually do you want us to change? So it's very important to keep in mind that governments budget for specific budget line items. So they budget for numbers of teachers in schools or medical supplies to X number of health posts. They don't actually budget for rights in the more abstract sense. The second challenge, of course, as many of you will know, is that the child marriage issue is often housed within the Ministry of Gender, Women, Social Welfare, or equivalent in your country. And often those are the ministries that have the least power, the least resources, the least influence among other government ministries as well. And that child protection issues more broadly are often not prioritised by government. So that's an important one to keep in mind, and that's why the sectoral outreach to other more influential line ministries such as education and health is critical in this work. Often what we've had as we're working on this, talking to ministries that are not child protection related, we hear, oh, but that's not the mandate of my ministry. That's the mandate of, the Ministry of Gender and Social Welfare. And I think what we're finding, though, is that interventions to prevent and respond to child marriage are actually scattered across many different government line in ministries, but we haven't explicitly identified how perhaps a line item in the Ministry of Health that supports young teen mothers, we haven't made that link around how that actually links to the issue of child marriage. Another critical one is that it's very difficult to say what constitutes a child marriage budget or what it looks like. Often there's a very poor disaggregation of budget information. In most cases, this has something to do with the budget classification system. So it's difficult to identify those child marriage budget line items. And often what we see is that child marriage budget line items, where they exist, are lumped together with bigger women's issues or children's issues, and it makes them invisible. So program-based budgeting may be a good option for helping to advocate for budgeting classification systems, which make it easier to identify those child marriage interventions. Spending benchmarks. The complexity of child marriage can make it difficult to know what actually constitutes an appropriate level of public spending on child marriage. It is, however, possible to work with your government to come up with a minimum package of expenditures for ending child marriage. And part of budgeting for child marriage arises from that fact that the issues evolve over time, and you often require behaviour change in the home and school and communities. So it makes long-term financial planning and budgeting difficult to know whether those behavioural changes will last. This is in contrast to education or health, where you can make a long-term forecast of how much money is required, where and when. Do we have the right data on child marriage to inform budgets? Often what we find is that the information relating to prevalence and incidence of child marriage in a country is incomplete. So we always have some relevant statistics from DHS, from MICS, from violence against children surveys, perhaps from vulnerability assessments during humanitarian emergencies, but they don't always provide adequate information to assist in costing and budgeting for child marriage interventions. So this can make it difficult without those disaggregated statistics around child marriage. So accurate, disaggregated, regular and timely data and information on child marriage is a key ingredient to this budget advocacy work. And the last challenge that we have come across is that the availability of budget documents to the public can be a challenge in many contexts. when we're talking about this work on budget advocacy, in some contexts, availability of public budget documents just doesn't exist. And as you know, there are a number of different budget documents, and I can send through the information of which you need available. You need those key documents available before you can even start on budget advocacy. So many Girls Not Brides members, we've found their first point, an entry point on working on this, is asking their government to share public budget data with them. I know that was a lot of information all at once, and I hope you can all hear okay. And I'll be sharing more detailed information on this. But the key takeaway around how budget advocacy and child marriage link is really to keep in mind that as we start to talk and advocate on this issue, there is no such thing as a child marriage budget. Because child marriage is such a multi-sectoral issue which impacts a girl's health, her education, her livelihood, her safety, and so many other aspects, that means there's no one single budget line for ending child marriage, and we have to be really smart and work out which interventions are we talking about and advocating for when we're preventing and responding to child marriage. And it's very much our role as advocates to prioritize which sector and which budget lines we want to advocate to government for, because you can't do everything at once. So it's very important to say, I'm going to advocate to the Ministry of Health for better service provision of adolescent-friendly health services in X number of counties or regions or provinces, for example. Or I'm going to advocate to my provincial level assembly to allocate budgets for our women's shelters in my area. It's important to be very specific about what you're asking. So moving then forward to the role of civil society in budget advocacy. So what we've found as we're working on this, and it may seem quite obvious, but it's often what people jump to first when they're starting to learn about budget advocacy to address child marriage, is that we're talking about so much more than just asking for budget allocation and for more money from government to address child marriage. And civil society has a really critical role in really helping to support the many different ways that you can work on budget advocacy to address child marriage. So some of the things that we've found that civil society have a really key role in doing on this topic is very much connecting the often very dry technical budget numbers that you'll often get through a budget analysis with the real life stories of girls on the ground, with the girls that they work with every day. And that ability to connect what's happening in government expenditure for adolescent girls with the real life story of how perhaps poor service provision has impacted the life of one girl or 10 girls, that creates a really powerful story and really helps with that advocacy work to decision makers. What we've seen in many contexts is actually government has already allocated budget for adolescent girls across different sectors, but the money is not reaching where it should. So the role of civil society is really advocating for more perhaps gender equitable distribution of those funds or more efficient use of those resources. CSOs also have a key role in advocating for resources within and across different sectors. So really talking to your health officials and sensitizing them and working with them so that they understand how different line items in the health sector actually help to prevent or respond to child marriage. And often different civil society organisations have expertise and relationships with different sectors. So I'd really encourage, if you do more work on SRHR and you work more with the health sector, to really use that as an entry point to work with a sector that you are familiar with, that you know people and have good, strong relationships with government already, and to use that as your entry point. I wouldn't start with another sector where you don't know anyone, you don't know the language, etc. Another role that we've really seen CSOs playing a vital role is improving government transparency and accountability, and really saying, look, you haven't released the budget for next year. We haven't seen those public documents. How did that process and how did those decisions come about? So really asking for that increased transparency from government about how they make decisions on what money they're spending. Another vital role of CSOs is empowering citizens, and we see, especially in terms of working with young people, young girls as well, to participate in budgetary processes. They're also very good at shining a light on budget leakage, wastage, and bottlenecks, and monitoring the quality of service provision, monitoring existing expenditure as well. So that role, we've been working with a number of members of Girls Not Brides, and I think what was really exciting coming into this topic is that so many Girls Not Brides members are doing this amazing work on budget advocacy to address child marriage already. So we're not starting from a base, a foundational base. It's really starting from quite an advanced area, and it's more a case of learning of what is already happening and what can be scaled and what can be learned from as well for other contexts. So we've seen really great work by CSOs in terms of simplifying what is very often very complex budget information. So perhaps producing a pamphlet that shows what's happening in the budget cycle and the entry points for citizens to have their say, or for other civil society organizations to influence budget processes. Civil society has also done great work in terms of showing the impact of current budgets on the lives of adolescent girls. So perhaps taking a parliamentarian or a local decision maker to the local health service, which is very poorly resourced, and saying, look, this girl went to your health service, but there was no doctor there. She wasn't able to get this operation. She couldn't get this advice, etc. So demonstrating the poor quality of different services that girls need can be really powerful. Often as well, there's a lot of approaches that are quite similar to social accountability approaches. So citizens participatory budgeting programs have been really great. We've often seen as well CSOs playing a vital role in helping to create spaces for citizens to have their say in budget making processes. And often the role of CSOs in monitoring budget allocation and the use of funds has been really important as well. And what we've seen as well is that often a lot of work can be pushed quite quickly at the subnational level, especially in contexts where you have devolved systems of governance. Which has been really great to see. So we're really excited, and we're also hoping that this webinar is an opportunity to find out and hear more about your own work and what you're doing in your own countries as we kind of strengthen this whole area of work. So moving now to different resources that you might be interested in that might support your work on budget advocacy. And it doesn't matter if you're starting out or if you've been working on influencing local budgets for the last 20 years, they may be of interest to you. So we have a Girls Not Brides background resources document available, which I'll send after the webinar. And this is a compilation of key resources on budget advocacy and gender responsive budgeting. And it's quite a lengthy document, but it collates different videos, different toolkits, different trainings that you might give within the health sector or education sector on influencing budget processes. There are a lot of different reports as well. The second resource is that often for civil society organisations, it can be challenging to conduct the budget analysis, which is often quite a technical piece of work, and to have that capacity to do that in-house. So we're able to link you to different resources and different organizations within your country or region that have expertise in budget analysis, or who you might be able to work with and leverage the partnership with to be able to have that data to then use in your broader advocacy work. Working collectively. So you're probably not the only one working on budget advocacy to address child marriage in your country. And so we're very happy to link you up to others that we know are working on the same topic, and perhaps in countries where there are national partnerships or coalitions, to start thinking about and linking up with others to have more collective efforts around budget advocacy as well. At the Girls Not Brides Secretariat, we host a working group on budget advocacy to end child marriage. If you're interested in joining this group, please email me, matilda.branson@girlsnotbrides.org. And please just let me know about what work you've been doing on budget advocacy, or if you're starting out, where you're working, and we can take it from there. The next working group call will be at the end of September. And then we also have, we've been supporting members to do, there's an online gender responsive budgeting training hosted by UN Women, which is a great foundational course and introduction to gender responsive budgeting, which relates very closely to many of the complexities of budget advocacy for child marriage. The spaces are a little bit limited, so they will be allocated on a first come, first served basis. And we have a number of other resources available. So if you are really interested and passionate about this topic, please send me an email after this webinar so that we can follow up bilaterally on this, and to hear more about your own work in your country on budget advocacy for child marriage. So we're moving now. We've got just under 20 minutes to do some questions and answers. So my colleague Alexandra has been collating some of your questions as they've been coming through. We'll do our best to address most of them. If we don't have time to address all of them, I'll send out a response in the follow-up email, where I'll also share the webinar presentation. So moving to questions now. So our first question. Okay, Alex, what's our first question?
So, what indicators are crucial when accounting for the budget requirements? I'll ask you the second question at the same time, so that you can think of the first. Also, given that child marriage is not limited to just one ministry, there are other key ministries, how do we then advocate for budget allocation and expenditure in an integrated manner?
So great questions. So the first one around indicators is a really important one. And there are a number of proxy indicators that we have available across different sectors that we can use to really to link what might be a direct or indirect intervention to address child marriage with the budget line. What I'll do is, we have an indicators document which has a list of the many proxy indicators that you might use to measure the impact on child marriage that I'll share with the follow-up resources, because I think it's a really great resource to be able to look at what is currently being spent in your government budget on adolescent girls across the different sectors, and to try and see what proxy indicators you might be able to use, and that often already exist within government reporting mechanisms, that you can try and highlight and link to addressing child marriage. And then in terms of, I think the question around, given that child marriage is not limited to just one ministry, how do we then advocate for budget allocation and expenditure in an integrated way? That's a fantastic question. I think there are 2 points to that. I think as we advocate around budget advocacy to address child marriage, there is one strand of work that has to continue, which is keeping the issue of child marriage on the political agenda. Because if the issue of child marriage is not prioritised by presidents and prime ministers and first ladies, then the trickle-down effect is not going to be seen by government bureaucrats in line ministries. They're not going to see the political importance or imperative for working on direct or indirect interventions to address child marriage. So I think in terms of that, on one hand, we still have to continue our advocacy at those higher levels to keep policymakers and decision makers interested and passionate about the issue of child marriage more broadly in that very holistic, multi-sectoral form. I think as in terms of the budget advocacy work, though, we then have to become more specific in terms of what we're asking to specific ministries and departments in terms of those specific budget lines. So I don't think you can do one without the other. You need that top level advocacy, keeping child marriage on the political agenda, and also that ability as you're working with line ministries and departments to be very specific about which sector, which budget line are you advocating for within health, within education, within child protection, etc. In terms of our next question.
Yes, we have many comments and questions coming in, so I'll prioritize the questions first over the comments. So the webinar focuses a lot on advocacy to governments, to ministries. Can you share some pointers on budget advocacy with donors and corporate funders? Question. And another question. So there was a comment about needing another webinar on understanding the aspects of budget in the context of child marriage. How can we analyze the budget lines of different ministries and how it links to child marriage? Without that understanding, it's a bit hard to do the advocacy.
Sure. So I'll start first with the question around how do we start budget advocacy on child marriage if we don't understand perhaps the budget process, how decisions are made, how to conduct a good budget analysis that we can then use in our broader advocacy efforts. It's a really critical question. I think that came from Suresh Kumar Pragani. So this webinar is very much just an introduction to the topic to see who is interested out there. And what we're planning is to really, if there is a critical amount of interest, we will then embark on a series of other webinars that are a lot more technical and dive into the different steps that CSOs can undertake in terms of this work around budget advocacy, and really bringing in the expertise of different partners as well, and organizations who already do a lot of work in terms of gender responsive budgeting, public financial management as well. So we're working closely with different organizations to really to work out who has the expertise in different areas. So stay tuned. If we have that critical mass and interest following this webinar, then we will be giving that webinar a series of webinars on more specific information. One of those, and for CSOs a really critical one, is how do you start with that good concrete budget analysis to get out that really crunchy information that you can then use in your broader advocacy efforts. And then
budget advocacy with donors and corporate funders.
So the other question was around pointers on budget advocacy when you're working with donors and other corporate funders. So for us, it's quite a new topic, budget advocacy to address child marriage. But the reason the Secretariat that we're really getting involved in it is to really create an evidence base and an investment case as well, to be able to talk to donors and other corporate funders on this. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're actually piloting 6 different budget advocacy projects of Girls Not Brides members in different countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that are very short pilots, but are designed by members themselves, not by us, to really show the different ways that budget advocacy can be conducted and conducted really well and effectively with very little resources as well. So that will be finished at the end of November, and we're hoping that will help to strengthen our evidence base alongside the work that we're finding out all the time that other members are doing, that the experiences that are coming out from the working group on budget advocacy as well, to really help us build towards the end of 2019 a really solid case of why budget advocacy is important, but also how it's effective and how it can be done quite effectively, and that really vital role that Girls Not Brides members can play in doing this.
Thanks. Someone is asking if we have any case studies or success stories on the allocation of budget on child marriage specifically for learning.
We absolutely do. So in March this year, we had a brainstorming workshop in Nairobi, bringing together Girls Not Brides members who have been working on budget advocacy, and also other experts from UN agencies, from social policy backgrounds and similar, to really nut out some of these key challenges and next steps forward on budget advocacy to address child marriage. And at that meeting, we actually had about 15 excellent case studies presented by civil society members on what they've been doing to address child marriage. A lot of really great examples, especially at the subnational level, that we can share with you. And more recently, a member in Nigeria had successfully worked with the state government to get a budget line for child marriage in next year's budget, which is really exciting. So we can share those case studies with you, and we're hoping to continue building up those numbers of case studies to really show that it's an effective area of work, and that a lot can be done with a small amount of resources as well.
Excellent. And do we have, or do we know of any consultants available to do specific national CSO platform detailed training on budget advocacy?
Sure. So in terms of consultants specifically, please email me after this, and depending on where you're from, I can probably put you in contact with different individuals or organizations in your country who are really, this is their bread and butter, doing budget analysis, doing budget advocacy across many different topics. What I would also encourage you all to do is that there's a fantastic organization called the International Budget Partnership, which have an amazing website and also a directory of countries where they list different organizations within each country that work on budget advocacy across many different topics. But I'd also encourage you to look at the IBP site and look at the country directory to see which organizations have that expertise in your country that you might be able to work with. If you can't find it, just email me and I can put you in touch.
Just to add, there are many comments coming in of people actually doing budget advocacy already, so you might as well contact them to see, to talk about their experience on the issue as part of the case studies that we have that we'll be documenting.
Yes, and please send through those who are sharing in the chat box there your different experiences. Please also email me with even just a paragraph on what you're doing. If you're really interested in this and want to continue this work, yes, please get in touch and we'll follow up with a bilateral call to hear more about the important work that you're doing.
We still have time for another
I
question?
think we've got time. We've got a couple more minutes, and there's so many questions. Again, if we're not able to get through to all of them, I'll do my best. We're compiling all of the questions coming through, and I will address any big points in the follow-up. I think we've got time for one or two more questions.
Okay, so we have a question from Michael from Tanzania. They are doing budget advocacy within their platform, but the challenge is the government willingness to prioritize the issue. So how can they gain more support and more political will? That's a big question.
Yes, an excellent question. So I think it relates back to the question earlier. I think at a very high level, it's important to work with your top decision makers and heads of ministries to sensitize them to the issue of child marriage. And often that's a case of working alongside them to really demonstrate, what is the impact of child marriage on a girl's health, on her education, on her family, on her community as well. You may have heard there's a piece of research that was done by the World Bank and the International Centre for Research on Women in 2017 that measured the economic impact of child marriage on the economies of different countries. And that research has been very useful in working with ministries of finance and decision makers who might not listen to the human rights argument, but might listen a bit more to the economic argument of the benefits of addressing child marriage for a country's economy. So I think in terms of getting that willingness, though, across different government sectors especially, it's important to look at your expertise and to think about who's in the government and what are they going to listen to, and to really look for your entry points. So I think in Tanzania, for example, ending wild child marriage and girls issues might be a little bit sensitive at the moment. There may be entry points, for example, there's the National Ending Violence Against Children strategy, which child marriage, there's a big component on. So it might be more effective pushing through the ending violence lens and getting child marriage in through that, rather than starting with child marriage at the centre. Really depends, though, on what you think your political leaders listen to and where those softer entry points are. And I think we have time for one more question.
All right, so a question from Tanzania. So Barnabas from Tanzania truly agrees that the budget analysis tool is an innovative way to advocate to end child marriage in Tanzania. And he'd like to know the feasibility of this tool in countries where child marriage is sanctioned by the law.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So I think budget analysis can be used in any context, regardless of what the law says about child marriage, whether it's allowed or not. I think what is really important is to look at the sectoral allocations for girls. So for example, in a country where perhaps child marriage is allowed, you might be doing, or other organisations might be doing, advocacy around legislative change to ensure that child marriage becomes banned or the legal age of marriage is changed, etc. In terms of the budget advocacy, though, at the same time, you can be looking at what other areas you could be advocating for to improve the chances of a girl at risk of child marriage, or for supporting married girls. So at the same time, you can still be advocating for perhaps more quality education for girls, or retention of girls within education, or perhaps support for married girls who are victims, survivors of violence within marriage, or similar. So at the same time, even if the kind of policy legal framework is actually supporting and perpetuating child marriage, you can still be working on different budget lines within different sectors to be supporting girls, taking down some of the barriers that exist for accessing different services and similar. And I think that's all we've got time for today. We've had an amazing number of comments and questions, so I am really, really sorry if we haven't been able to respond to all of you. I hope everyone's been able to connect okay. In terms of next steps, I will be sending around the presentation from the webinar. I'll also be sharing a report that really goes into some of the detail around what we know, some of the challenges, the role of civil society in budget advocacy, and I'll also be sharing some of those key resources and support and information around the online training on gender responsive budgeting as well. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you did find it useful and you want to continue in this work, please email me and let me know, because then we could actually take next steps to do more detailed technical webinars on this topic, because it is a huge topic. There are many different areas and you can't deal with all of it in a 1 hour webinar. But I hope this was a really helpful introduction to budget advocacy to address child marriage. Thank you to all of you again for joining. We really appreciate it. And I really hope to hear from you following this webinar. And thank you to Alexandra for moderating the discussion and the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Absolutely. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.